Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Dadouch. I just looked at my name to double check. My name is Sarah Dadouch. I'm a former Washington Post correspondent in Beirut. I've recently worked with the Financial Times covering Syria after the fall. And I'm here going to be your moderator today for strategic partners, China and Syria's relationship before the fall of Assad. I want to take a moment just to welcome our panelists very quickly. We have with us Mr. Armenak, Tokmajyan, who's a non-resident fellow at the Malcolm H. Carnegie Middle East Center, focusing on Syria, who's joining us via Zoom link. We have Mr. Jihad Yazigi, who's the editor-in-chief of the Syria Report and is an associate fellow at the IFI. And we also have Dr. Lishen Wang, who's an associate professor at the Institute of International Relations at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, whose PhD focuses on Syrian-Chinese relations. I'm going to start by actually asking Mr. Armenak, if I could, about the political developments recently that we've seen in Syria and how they're going to affect China. I think a big thing that we have is the Uyghur question and security concerns that China would have in Syria. And I'm just going to let you take the lead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Let me start immediately because I've prepared I've written my presentation and I don't want to take more than 30 minutes of time. Given that I'm going first, I thought I would do three levels analysis. On the international level, things have changed a lot with Trump's visit. It has implications on the region. I'll talk a little bit about that. And coming to the local power struggle, local power dynamics, and concluding by few specific remarks on the Uyghur question. In this way, I thought I'll open the floor for my colleague Jihad to take on the political economy side, and also open the way for more discussion, a more specific discussion on the Uyghur question. Without further ado, let me boil down on the international level that there were, before Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia and his meeting with Syria's interim president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, there were essentially two key regional projects for Syria. One was seeking to stabilize and rebuild Syria, and this was pursued by and large by Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and supported by EU. This approach sought to stabilize Syria under the leadership of Ahmed al-Sharaa, legitimize him, and give a go-ahead to his state-building, or what he calls as a state-building project. The counter policy was mainly pursued by Israel, and I would say it sought to fragment Syria or keep it fragmented and legitimize or maybe cement the fragmentation that Syria lives today, to keep it weak by supporting the Druze, by Kurds lobbying Washington to keep the sanctions on Syria. So there was these two conflicting projects on Syria. What happened essentially was the Trump effect. Trump arrived in Saudi Arabia. He decided to meet Ahmed al-Sharaa based on Saudi and Turkish recommendations, and essentially sided with the first project, which was, to stabilize the situation in Syria. He put forth certain conditions. At the top of the list was foreign fighters. Another important condition was to eventually reconcile with Israel. And there was no mention of democracy or inclusive governance, etc. So this Trump effect, I would say it was quite important. And I would even go further saying that it has the potential to change the trajectory of Syria's post-war era. This came with a lot of implications on regional level, but also on the local level. Starting by the regional level, let me try to give, not quite 360-degree view, but let's try to take the implications on key actors in the region. On Israel, there were reports that Trump did not consult with Israel when he decided to shake hands with Al-Sharaa and lift sanctions. Those could be quite true. Israelis seem a bit surprised. However, we need to remember that the U.S., or at least I would argue that the U.S. did not really undermine Israeli interests. On the contrary, it was on top of Trump's list. He urged Al-Sharaa to make peace with Israel, eventually join the Abrahamic Accord. So U.S. had, I would say, Israeli interests in mind. But more importantly, I think Trump's move, what would change is that I think it could potentially change Israel-Syria dynamics for the years ahead. Russia seemed to me quite surprised, judging from Russian officials' statements. Russia, prior to Trump's visit, seem to have thought that they are in line with U.S. policy in Syria, but not quite so, because their position has been weakened by Trump's move, although they will remain a player, but their bargaining power with the current administration has become weaker. When it comes to Iran, I think this was, in short, they cemented their power. Trump essentially cemented Iran's non-involvement in Syria. And with Turkey, on the contrary, was kind of a recognition of Turkey's achievement in the region, in Syria in particular, and I would say also some sort of a blessing to play a bigger role in Syria and Levant through Syria. This has strengthened Turkey's position vis-à-vis the Kurds. It has bolstered its political, economic, regional ambitions to play a bigger role in Syria and the Levant, and of course to capitalize on Syria's reconstruction bonanza. Because I see them as, probably the only or the actor which has the greatest capacity to engage in reconstruction in Syria. To Saudi Arabia, again, I am not entirely sure what is the Saudi strategic goal. I have to be candid with you. But it seems to me that stabilization in Syria would benefit Saudi's own, strategic economic goals and will win them an ally in the heart of Levant. But U.S. apparently has, recognized Saudi key role in the region. On Lebanon, I wanted to include Lebanon because recently there were reports that does this mean that there is a new mandate, new Wisaya in Arabic on Lebanon, led by al-Sharaa, the new administration in Damascus? I wouldn't say so, and that's simply because Ahmed al-Sharaa barely controls the Syria. Probably half of the country is outside his control. They have very minimal ability to do basic governance, so let alone having a mandate on Lebanon. Having said that, certain files could become more important and more amplified, such as, for example, the Islamist prisoners issue in Lebanon, or maybe some Salafis would feel more empowered in Lebanon. However, I think it's very early to talk about Syrian Wisaya on Lebanon. Finally, I think Trump's effect will push Turkey and Israel to talk more about Syria, not to turn Syria into a major, thorn in their relationship. However, I foresee that this regional competition will continue and will have its impact, on the whole region. Coming to the to the national level, I want to just say briefly that I would boil down the impact to two main avenues. There will be economic consequences with lifting the sanctions, but I think Jihad will talk about that. So I want to focus more on the implications on power dynamics. And what I would say with one sentence is that now al-Sharaa has stronger international legitimacy, and soon will have more economic resources, which in turn will empower him and his administration to do the following: to reward the loyals, to coerce, to force and co-opt certain segments of Syrian society, which will be important to build his power structure, but also banish and exile certain rivals. I think he has the tools now to do that. And we will see this manifesting itself in various parts of Syria. For instance, in the south, just to give you a concrete example, in the south, politically, al-Sharaa was a bit weak. There were segments of society in Daraa and Suwaida who did not want to deal with Sharaa, who did not want to legitimize him. Now those forces have been weakened, and Sharaa will have stronger bargaining position against them, thanks to what Trump has done. Economically, Sharaa did not have the money, the resources to co-opt those segments of the society who actually wanted to engage with Sharaa. Now he can buy them, he can reward them, he can pour some resources. We will see this kind of ebb and flow and power dynamics, I think, across Syria, but it will not come without repercussions. I think there will be a lot of backlashes, and here I want to mention ISIS, which has been quite active recently. I think the recent developments are not just in favor of Sharaa. I think he will see some of his ideologically hardened base drifting away simply because he's shaking hands with the U.S., who's been an enemy for many decades. So I think there will be repercussions, but there will also be power struggle and power competition within his coalition. We're talking today about an Idlibi current, a Deir ez-Zor current. We're talking about his family being at the center of the new power structure. We're talking about rivalry between Turkey-related, Turkey-backed new economic elite coming from the north versus the traditional Damascene economic elite, etc., etc. Now I want to conclude with 1 or 2 minutes by coming to the foreign fighters issue, especially the Uyghurs. And you can study this issue from many perspectives, but I want to connect it to what I just presented. I see the Uyghur issue connected to international level politics, but also to local power dynamics. And here is how. Initially, when Ahmed al-Sharaa took over Damascus, there was a lot of discomfort. I mean, I've met some decision makers, especially in the EU. There was certainly discomfort that foreign fighters played a major role in this offensive. That's one. And there was a concern that they will continue playing a major role. So there were a few scenarios being discussed. One of them was to kick them out of Syria, or force the Sharaa to kick them out of Syria. The second one was to concentrate them somewhere in Syria, contain them, like the Idlib model. Essentially, in Idlib, they were concentrated around Jisr al-Shuhur, and see what happens with them later. And the third scenario was to contain them within the ranks of Syrian institutions, army and security in particular. The third option seemed quite strange, Can you imagine an Uyghur general commanding, thousands of Syrians? That seemed quite odd. However, with Trump's move, things have moved towards that direction. The third scenario seems to be, being implemented at the moment in Syria. And the case in point is that just a couple of days ago, there were reports that some 3,500 foreign fighters, especially Uyghurs, will be dissolving their own, respective groups and joining the Syrian army under the banner of the 84th Division. I would say that this was confirmed by U.S. envoy to Syria, that this was agreed, or at least U.S. was happy with this solution. And in fact, I would envision that things might go further, keeping them in the army, giving them Syrian IDs, giving them passports, maybe bank accounts, and essentially, integrating into a legitimate system where they can be tracked and traced, instead of letting them go and do to other jihadi quests around the world. This is not necessarily good for Syria, but this has been this has been favored by US, but also by al-Sharaa. We know that months before Trump's visit, I know from sources close to the administration that he in fact favored the third scenario, which was containing the foreign fighters rather than letting them go. But this is not the full story. I think there are at least two other reasons. One is that the foreign fighters are integral to his own security, I would argue. Because, he could rely on them. Those are fearsome fighters, loyal to al-Sharaa himself, and within any struggle inside Syria, he could potentially rely on them against Syrian or non-Syrian rivals. That's one. Second, foreign fighters will apparently play a hedge against certain insurrections, especially from the Alawites. There are reports that the 84th Division will be located in the coastal regions, and if so, this will be a hedge against the Alawites and probably even the Russians, who will still maintain two bases there. To conclude with one sentence, things are in flux. And things can go, wrong and can go in different directions. That's some sort of a caveat I want to give at the very end. Just to not forget that Syria is emerging from 13, 14 years of civil war. We have a nascent, inexperienced administration who is trying to do something. Yes, do have the international legitimacy and some revolutionary support from within, but, they are inexperienced. And sadly, the issue of democracy, inclusivity, having a more inclusive national framework for Syria seems to have gone to the background with Trump's endorsement of al-Sharaa, and unfortunately with EU, not using these vocabularies anymore and prioritizing stabilization over, some sort of an inclusive government for all inside Syria. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Armenak. I'll come back to follow-up questions on containment and how it will affect Chinese interests. A lot of follow-ups, but first I'm gonna throw it to Mr. Jihad to ask about reconstruction in Syria, and are we likely to see willingness from China to invest in Syria, considering the history that it's had with Assad recently and the lack of initiatives that were happening there? What's China's likely economic approach to the new government and the new Syria?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. If you don't mind, maybe I'll provide first a background on the economic situation in Syria, and then talk of China in particular. I also want to thank both IFI and Friedrich Ebert for inviting me here. I'm also very happy to see that there is an event in Lebanon where people talk about Syria. I was just telling friends during the break, I was astonished I attended two trade fairs, the two largest trade fairs since the fall of the regime in Damascus. The first one in March, there were 256 companies attending it. There were 110 Turkish companies, so 100-something Syrian, and not a single Lebanese one, not a single one. And then there was a larger fair held a few days ago, Buildex, construction on building materials, even bigger, 740 companies. I just asked a few minutes ago, my journalist who went there, I wasn't there, I told him, did you see any Lebanese companies? He told me, I saw one or two. There are probably more. There were more than 100 Turkish and one or two Lebanese, which is really striking. The first one, there were around 11 Chinese companies, actually. Anyway, how is the economic situation in Syria? So, of course, we have all the headlines and the sanctions lifting, which is great news for the economy in Syria, which will offer a lot of opportunities. But today, the socioeconomic situation in Syria is very, very, very bad. People are poor, and for any one of you going to Damascus, you need to realize that what you see in Damascus is not Syria. I'll give a very small example. The farming sector, the agricultural sector, is in a terrible, terrible situation. Water levels in Damascus are at their lowest since 1958. The FAO even reported recently that the wheat production today is 75% lower than what was expected, so 25% of expectation. And the Ministry of Agriculture, and we learned this from a source at the ministry, is actually considering stopping all support to wheat production in Syria. They are never going to announce it because this has terrible consequences. It's not only an economic impact, but it also has an impact on the whole life of rurality, actually, of the sociological life in Syria. But the situation is really bad. Salaries are very low, $20, $30, $40 per month. And behind, actually, the events in the coastal area of early March and the attacks, because it began with an attack by remnants of the regime against the central command, I mean the general command, the army, to some extent, poverty is behind it. The Alawite community in particular, because it overwhelmingly works in the public sector, and salaries are low, salaries were not paid, many Alawites, especially the army, were fired. So there is a lot of poverty in Syria, and that's a major issue. And one of the main factors actually behind the economic situation in Syria is the collapse of the Lebanese financial system, actually. We don't realize it enough. Everybody blames sanctions on almost everything to explain the situation in Syria, but the collapse of the Lebanese financial sector had a terrible consequences on Syria. People in Syria will tell you there is a before and after the Lebanese collapse. In any case, so things, despite this, of course, we have positive news. Syrians returning, and I reassure all of my friends in Lebanon, don't worry, more refugees will return after the end of the school year. There is announcement of investments. So there are good news, and there is the lifting of sanctions, of course. So where does China stand here? The first thing, it's important to know that before 2011, you had Chinese investments in Syria, but almost exclusively in the oil and gas sector. CNPC, China National Petroleum Company, was a shareholder in al-Furat Petroleum Company, which is the biggest public-private sector company, oil company in Syria. It was extracting around 100,000 barrels of oil a day, which for Syria is a big volume. CNPC was a partner of Shell, actually, in that project. Another two other Chinese companies, Sinopec and Sinochem, were also present in Syria. Sinochem is a partner of Gulfsense, which has probably the most promising field, which is located in northeast Syria, under currently control of the ANES. So these companies did not formally declare force majeure like the Western companies, but basically after the Western sanctions and the escalation in the violence in 2012, these companies froze their business activity in Syria. So of course, as an oil country, Syria's potential is very small relative to the Gulf and to Iraq, but on the Levant, it's relatively important. And I wouldn't be surprised that the Chinese, one of the first priorities would be to return to control these oil fields. In particular, because I think that a lot of Western oil companies that were active in Syria would be very reluctant to come back. So I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, CNPC buys the shares of Shell in their joint venture, that Total hands over its assets to another company, and Chinese companies could be interested. But anyway, the picture before 2011 was Chinese investment in the energy sector, almost only in that sector. There was also relatively important trade volumes. China was the first supplier, so the first import country to Syria, almost at a par with Turkey, a bit higher than Turkey. So China exported every year $2.5 billion of products to Syria. Syria exported almost nothing, unsurprisingly. So that was the economic situations, and you had few other investments by Chinese companies. You had a Chinese plant had a contract to build a big power plant, several $100 million, but it never materialized because of the conflict. So then we have 2011, the uprising, the violence, the sanctions. What happened? So as I said, the oil companies divested, or at least froze their activities. Trade declined markedly, so we went from 2.5 to $1.2 billion of trade between the two countries in 2018. And this fell after COVID to actually much lower numbers. In 2023, the last year for which I have numbers, Chinese exports to Syria were around $350 million. as compared with Turkish exports of above 1.5 billion. Now, one of the main supplier to Syria is UAE, actually, if you look at the official numbers. And a lot of UAE exports are actually hidden Chinese exports. They go via UAE, but because UAE is part of GAFTA, so they don't pay tariffs. But contrary to what may think, the Chinese involvement in the Syrian economy during the uprising was very limited. No investment, almost, unsurprisingly. No humanitarian aid also provided, which is actually telling because the EU and the US, which are supposed to be adversaries of the Chinese government, actually poured dozens of billions of dollars over the past 10 years in humanitarian aid in Syria, in neighboring countries. China, you have 1 year it's $20 million, another it's $15 million. It's really amounts that we cannot, not really meaningful. However, there were two important two important events, if you want, in the past few years. In 2002, Syria joined the Belt and Road Initiative. And in 2023, Bashar al-Assad went to Beijing with his wife. It was, from a PR perspective, a relatively successful visit. And Syria and China signed a strategic partnership agreement. Now, one thing to know about the Arab countries, whenever they sign a strategic partnership agreement, and you hear no more details about it, it's usually meaningless. But, you know, they signed a strategic partnership agreement, and indeed it didn't materialize into anything significant. So the conflict period was a period during which China was largely absent, economically at least, or financially. Contrary to countries like Russia, for example, or Iran, which did support significantly the Syrian economy. They were not absent, they were present. So what happens is December 8th. Again, I'm not, of course, addressing at all the security and political dimension of the subject. I'm not only talking about the economics. I would call China really the big absent country in Syria, and usually in the Levant, actually, I think. Surprisingly, the Chinese, so obviously they were supportive of Assad, but as one of the speakers in the first session said, the Chinese support any, usually, government in place in any country. Now, in April, Assad Shebani, the Syrian foreign minister, which is really the number 2 today in Syria, at least in the, politically he's number 2, announced that Syria and China were going to sign, guess what? A long-term strategic partnership agreement. He probably wasn't aware that there was already one signed in 2022, but it tells you how much it means nothing, these things. Why I'm saying the big absent, because if you have been following Syrian news, you must have heard of the many actually news that came out and projects. So Dubai Port signed a big agreement, $800 million deal, theoretically, MOU, to manage the port of Tartus. By the way, Tripoli should be I'm very concerned for Tripoli, actually, but anyway. So Dubai took the port of Tartus. CMA-CGM has the port of Latakia. The Qatari and Turks are taking control, more or less, of the airports, managing the airports. So usually the Chinese, you see them in big infrastructure projects. You haven't heard anything. No really major announcement here. Also, the Qatari and Turks announced, a big consortium actually of Qatari and Turkish companies signed just 10 days ago an agreement to invest $7 billion in the electricity sector in Syria to produce 5,000 megawatt of electricity. Again, the Chinese are not there. Okay, does that mean there are no opportunities for China? I don't think there aren't. Although they have been very cautious, and despite Shebani's statement, we see from both countries, actually, Syria and China, relatively cautious approach. I think there are some opportunities. One of them is the fact that the Syrian authority today, like Bashar actually before 2011, are very aware of the strategic geographic location of the country. Bashar, for example, had talked of a plan of a 5 Cs strategy for Syria. What were the 5 Cs? The 5 Cs were the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Caspian, the Red Sea. What else do we have? The Gulf, how do we call it? Whatever. Yani. So there was a plan to build a 5C. Well, he talked of it. He didn't build anything, but he talked of it. The government, for example, already before 2011, subcontracted to the private sector the management of the 2 ports. As I said, these are gone. But for example, among the other projects the Syrian authorities had were to build 2 major highways linking Turkey to Jordan through Syria and the Mediterranean to Iraq. So I can imagine that Chinese investors could be interested in this. The same applies to the rail track. Syria, for those who do not know it, has the largest rail track network in the Middle East, actually, even in the Arab world. Most of it used to transport commodities, wheat and phosphate. So there could be potential investment by Chinese company. And actually, I was talking of Chinese absence. I'm not completely, sorry, one other thing that the Syrians are trying to develop is something announced by the Minister of Telecommunications, Abdesalam Haikal, who sits on the board of trustees of AUB, by the way, Joseph, who is today the Minister of Telecommunications in Syria. He talked of the launch of a Silk Link project, Silk coming, of course, from the Silk Road. The idea being to use Syria as a transit hub for telecommunication network, and specifically internet, from the Mediterranean to the Gulf. Apparently, that's what he was explaining to me. The current internet links between the Gulf and even the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean and then Europe are all going through the Suez Canal, which is apparently very expensive. And the Syrians think that they have an opportunity here to develop something different. So they are pushing for a Silk Link project. And here it's interesting to say that the Syrians are actually open to Chinese involvement in the telecommunications sector. I have someone told me that actually the Syrians are talking with a European country which is getting rid of its Huawei equipment, particularly towers, because they want to get rid of Chinese technology. They're afraid of Chinese spying on them. And so the Syrians are trying to buy from a European country. I know the European country, but I cannot mention it. They're trying to buy these used equipment from Huawei to install them in Syria. So here, the Chinese may have also a role to play. So there was one major Chinese, and I'll finish here, one Chinese major investment announcement, which is an MOU was signed between the government, actually the ports and land crossing establishment. It's a new thing created by the new government in Syria. They signed a contract handing over to a Chinese company the entire free zone area of the Hassia industrial city. Syria has 3 big industrial cities near Damascus, Homs, and Aleppo. Hassia is near Homs, which is the closest to the port, to Tartus. So the Chinese are taking over 800,000 square meters of the free zone area in that industrial city for 20 years. And their responsibility will be to manage this this free zone, and basically to attract investment, probably Chinese investment, to export to Europe. And they also took, in addition to that, 300 square meters in the Adra industrial zone, which is near Damascus. We are talking of 1.1 million square meters of area for Chinese investment in the manufacturing sector in Syria. I'll stop here because it's been...
It's actually a great point to piggyback off of. Thank you, Mr. Jihad. A great way to end, actually, and bring on Dr. Lishen, because I wanted to ask you about how the fall of Assad will the fall of Assad undermine China's relations in the Middle East, and how does engagement with the new government, how will it affect its most valuable regional partnerships, specifically when it comes to Iran?
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for Armenak for some more detailed information about the relationship between the U.S. and the new government of Syria, and also the overall economic landscapes provided by Mr. Jihad. So then my part will be focused more on the diplomatic relations. And first of all, I have to say, the China-Syrian relationships on our official website before or now is officially said to be traditional friendship. It's like 传统友好. That's perhaps not only because the diplomatic ties started as early, but also no absolute shutdowns ever since then, and hopefully in the future. Because China's policy cares more about the continuity and the stability, not sudden changes. And there I have to say that China's policy towards Syria must be placed in the context of its overall Middle East policy. When it has the opportunity to assume a positive and a balanced role in the Middle East, not as a hegemony, but as a partner for development and mutual respect. So through like Belt and Road initiatives mentioned above and other initiatives, now China is focusing on development and good governance to ensure peace. Although what we can do may seemingly be limited, but still it's moving forward. So like, for example, jointly work on like economic transformations, environmental pollutions and the food problems, and anti-terrorism and extremism. So while China does not support the unilateral shaping of a region through external forces, the situation in the region itself will also influence its policy implementation. Unlike the region is experiencing what is called like geopolitical realignment, it's like many countries, not only Syria, but also Libya and Sudan, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, is continuing to grapple with the deep scars of some prolonged conflicts. And not only ending wars now, but rebuilding society, which has been mentioned, remains a far more complex challenge than initiating conflicts now. So one of the biggest challenges that must be faced in this region is the uncertainty that may arise after the U.S. withdraws as a main security provider. Its administration now is always advocating like American first and reduces the costs overseas, and seemingly to be living in a hurry and in a cost-saving way without caring about the security. It's not interested in what Armenak mentioned, the state building. Exactly. And if there were a clear framework, if there were fragile or not, to fully put it into practice is maybe not its necessity, at least less than its alliance that is really interested there. So we applaud for lifting the sanctions and decrease of military interventions, but the chaos left must be faced with. So then, overall, the region still has what is so-called regionalization deficit, and the uncertainty during the formation and stability of new orders will become a risk that we need to face together. And China will not strive to become one of the players be militarily relied on during this period. Of course, it's not practical at all. So let's talk about economics more. So maybe take an instance. Last time in another international conference, I hear questions about whether China will set up military bases in the Middle East, or how would China play its role with zero bases, zero troops, zero soldiers? And I have to say that's exactly what China is trying to do, to help partners avoid the endless circle of war and truce, obtain shared security, which it prefers to promote sustained operations, which will not be shut down suddenly then in the future, and by enhancing the local capabilities of government, and rather than creating new dependence, including not dependent on China itself as well. So like previous classic cases have long proved that external military operations will only cause endless troubles. Thus, regional actors and global players will remember and must coordinate better to avoid such past mistakes. And when external interference is reduced, the co-region agenda can be carried out more fairly. So it's also possible for the entire region to sit down and negotiate while also integrating as well. What China hopes is to promote this process, to put it forward. So moreover, to bring all parties into the conversation and help us set in the table. Like we have talks and friendly ties with Saudi and Iran and Palestine, Israel and Turkey, and promoting the regional unity. So now that China is obviously support the multilateral platforms such as the ASEAN and the GCC forums and others, and now we see Syria is also in dynamic context with those countries to settle problems together, like seeking consensus at least, which is likely to heading towards a brighter future. So many of the region's problems come with governance and development issues in Chinese eyes. So in aspects like railway rebuilding in Hijaz or other areas and recovery of industries, as you mentioned, where China might be able to provide with substantial and efficient solutions, it's not absent, it's still cautiously working forward. And also humanitarian aid is not emphasizing and doing something. Like also the new issues, besides traditional railways and real-life wars, like the digital gaps and other challenges also becoming increasingly apparent, not only in Syria, Lebanon, but also the whole region. Like the hot topic, artificial intelligence, which me and my colleagues are working on in recent days. Like in the future, the lethargy, casualty, and economic loss caused by them may be more horrible than wars. So while the boundaries and the cooperative space of new technologies might seemingly be also greatly broader. So I've just mentioned about what is called the traditional China. The next year would be the 7th anniversary of the establishment of the bio-diplomatic relations between the two states. So might it be a chance for a new era? So I think maybe China is also waiting for the answer, but also ready for cooperations. Whether the previous agreements will be fulfilled, especially about security and overseas profits. So will partners' consensus be taken seriously, etc.? Like the voices of both sides now need to be communicated more smoothly. Like my dear colleagues who have so detailed and fruitful personal information, which I like and I envious. And also despite propaganda and the linguistic barriers, I'll end here. So now thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lishen. Thank you for accommodating us despite the time difference. I'm gonna, I think, open it up to questions from the audience. Do I call on people? Yeah, go ahead.